particularly acknowledge that Xiliang arrived at Houston last night from Beijing to find his flight had been canceled and managed to still get here this morning. Max flew in late last night, and Valerie came in from Europe as well. So thanks to everybody, especially our speakers. Zhang did not make it. He is stuck in Detroit. But Yating is going to be presenting, a student of ours is going to be presenting his work. I should also note that we are recording this session, so we'll have a discussion at the end, but please, hopefully that's okay with everyone. So 2 weeks ago, China announced the formal start of a national emissions trading program for carbon dioxide. And I think on the one hand, this is kind of monumental in the sense that in one fell swoop, we double the volume of worldwide carbon emissions that are subject to some sort of pricing. On the other hand, it's a very different system design and a different economic system than a lot of us are familiar with. Obviously, there are a lot of government enterprises in China. There's a lot of price regulation. And I think a lot of us are asking exactly what that means. So it's with that in mind that we put together this session on the national ETS. There's actually a combination, it's kind of a combination of a paper panel and a paper session and a panel session in that we'll have each of the speakers go for about 18 minutes and then we'll have at least a half an hour at the end for a discussion and among the panelists who all come up here as well as the audience. So what I prefer to do during the talks is limit questions to just clarifying questions rather than discussion questions, and maybe jot down those discussion questions and come back to them at the end. We're also going to change the lineup just slightly, partly because I forgot to say that Larry Goulder did not make it, as well as Zhang. Max is actually going to present Larry's slides as well as doing the discussion. So with that in mind, the way we'll do the session is Xiliang and I will present first, then Valerie, then Yating, who will present Zhang's paper, and then Max will end presenting Larry's paper alongside of his own comments. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Xiliang, who will kind of introduce us. And I should also say, if you have any really hard questions, it's probably about the system design. It's him that you want to direct your questions to.
Thank you very much, Billy. So I'm really happy. So eventually I make the trip and come to join this session. So I know several colleagues of mine. So now we stay in Chicago and other cities of some cities. So that means I'm very lucky I can come here. So and also it's a great pleasure for me to come here to join you for this session to discuss about China's national, the design issues of China national carbon markets. So my introduction will be very brief because I would like just to give a brief introduction of the background of China ETS, and so Billy will give a more detailed introduction about the feature of the China ETS and also give us comments about the design. So the first question is I want to see is why does China want to introduce an emission trading system? So my observation is also is that I think because China really needs a special policy to address China's international climate pledges and the national targets. So as you see, so for the climate pledges, so China there are actually two very important pledges. So one is to decrease the carbon dioxide emission per unit of GDP. That is the carbon intensity. So these are the targets. The second target, so I think, is the non-fossil fuel targets. That means the non-fossil fuel. That means the renewable plus nuclear to increase the share of the non-fossil fuels. So these are the primary targets for China, and it's also under China's climate pledges. So so far, so we have a primary renewable energy policy, that is the renewable electricity feed-in tariff for the renewable targets, for the renewable pledge. But there is not primary policy to address the carbon intensity targets, so, and also the peaking of the CO2 emissions. That's why, so I believe China really needs a new special policy or another primary policy to address these issues. So this is the first question. So the second, so I would say, so this slide shows, so the roadmap, possible roadmap for the China National ETS construction program.
Seems to be one of your slides.
Yeah, I think so.
I just realized I had a version of it. Sorry, let me. I realized I was mucking around.
These are also very important slides.
Yeah. So let me bring that up and give you that slide.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I was like, where did that slide get from?
Okay. So the second question is what? So this second slide shows what's the context for China to design a national ETS. So I think so there are the circumstances of China building emission trading system is different from the Western nations. So the first is in China, the primary carbon dioxide emission will come from the industry. So from the industry, it's about totally about 80% of the CO2 emission from the industry. That means from the energy users. So the second, is in China, approximately over 70% of Chinese electricity used in the industry sector. So this is and also so there's still a large potential for the further reduction. So in the industry sector. So that means that the target sector for the ETS in China is the industry. So and the second is that the price of the electricity and the natural gas and oil products is heavily controlled by the government. That means there is in China the increased a bit in the cost. So for the CO2 mitigation, so it cannot be passed down to the users. So the final energy users is a big issue. So for really the design of China's ETS. So instead of favoring ETS, the Chinese government really don't know what the Chinese ETS should look like. So because the unique circumstances. So and in this context, China first start the pilots. So in the 5 cities and 2 provinces. So this is the approach. So it's a gradual approach. We'll do like pilots to see what the ETS should look like. So actually, from the year 2013, 7 ETS pilots implemented in China. After 5 years of pilots, so right now, by the end of last year, 2 weeks ago, China really announced or released China's national emission trading program. So I think the program is largely based on the regional ETS. That means the design of the national ETS. So it's very much based on the ETS pilots and marrying the unique circumstances of China for the ETS. So this is the idea. So and also even as Pili mentioned, China already announced the official start of the ETS. Actually, for the first 3 years, so the primary work for the national ETS will be on the construction of the trading platform, and also the development of more specific protocols for the allowance allocation, and also it's the national legislation, and also the national legislation. That means it will need, and also finally, also a trial of the national system. That means for the first 2 years, where it's not a real run of national ETS. So it's expected since start from the year 2020, so the national system could run, can have a real run, and also the national system. So it's largely is based on tradable performance standards. So this is, I think, the primary feature of China's ETS. So so it will be. It takes 5 years. So for the construction of the ETS, and start with the power generation sector. Eventually, so all the 8 sectors will be covered by the ETS. So at the same time, the regional pilots also exist with the national system, then merge together by the end of 2025. So this is the time framework for the ETS development. And then how about after year 2025? So the government so far have not very clear plan. So so I think this is the background information. So I would like to my colleague Billy will give a more detailed discussion, the detailed introduction of the feature of the ETS, and give comments.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to do the second half of this presentation, which unfortunately, as you might have guessed, I was editing a different version of it while we were all traveling here. So let me just go to this next slide. So there are, as Xiliang said, I think that the key thing is that this is a tradable performance standard. So you can think about every sector in the ETS as having some benchmark in this equation B, and the allocation to that sector is going to be B times whatever the output of that sector is. And the total cap, in some sense, is the accumulation across all these sectors of this benchmark times the level of output. As Xiliang mentioned, this is really following the experience of the pilots, and it's consistent with concerns in the sectors about growth and fairness and things like that. If you want to think mechanically about how this is going to work, you could imagine some sector with a variety of, let's see if this little pointer thing works. This distribution would be the distribution of different firms or facilities on the x-axis, the emission rate on the y-axis, and you see very clean firms over here, very dirty firms over here. This is the current average, volume-weighted average, output-weighted average of the sector, and you would set some sort of standard maybe down here for that sector. Mechanically, also the way it works is kind of interesting if you read about it, which is that they give an initial allocation at the beginning of the year based on previous levels of output. That's this allocation A to each firm. But then at the end of the year, after they've actually observed what the level of output is, they give this adjustment, which is equal to the actual output times the benchmark minus whatever the initial allocation was. So, when Xiliang and I were first talking about this, it wasn't obvious that this was a performance standard, that it was actually fully proportionate to output. But as we discussed it, and we had this 3-hour conversation in Beijing that's very vivid to me, I was like, wait a second, this is an intensity or a rate-based or a performance standard, and that's very different than what we've had in the US, to date at least. So I really just want to make 3 main points, and even though there are 4 bullets here, and really one main point. The italicized point is one that I think most people are familiar with, which is that when we have tradable performance standards, product prices do not rise as much. And I think there have been a lot of papers and discussions about that. What I think is kind of new and interesting is when you have a multi-sector tradable performance standard, and this is where I'm going to focus my attention, or a sectoral performance standard where different subcategories of plants get different benchmarks, which by the way is the same way the Clean Power Plan in the United States was designed. You have this interesting possibility that instead of just having lower product price increases relative to a cap and trade, you can actually have product price declines. And if you have that in dirtier sectors, you could actually have an overall increase in emissions, which is kind of a weird result and one thing we want to be worried about. There are two other things I'll mention briefly if I have time, which is that another problem when you actually expand out of one sector is that if you have a energy intensive sector like electricity and the product price is not rising enough, and then you go downstream and you regulate industry, you have to re-regulate electricity downstream again. And that's something that originally I thought had to do with price controls in China, but really has to do more fundamentally with the use of tradable performance standards. And then I'll briefly mention that, you know, as some people know, I like price floors a lot, or price ceilings, and it's kind of confusing to think about how you would do that in this context. So just a quick explanation of the zeroth point. If you imagine a sector with a marginal abatement cost curve that looks like this blue line, so emissions per unit of output are on the horizontal axis, and marginal abatement costs on the vertical axis. This goes up to the left because abatement is going to the left. You can imagine setting some sort of standard that would correspond to some sort of equilibrium price. If you implemented this price with a tax, you would have an increase of costs in that sector given by the yellow area. That is, the sector has to pay the incremental abatement costs to get to this standard, but then it also has to pay for all the inframarginal emissions. And presumably this cost increase would get passed downstream to product users. When you have a tradable performance standard, you get an allocation proportionate to your output, effectively this hashed area. So as you produce more stuff, you get more allocation. It's like a subsidy, and your actual increase in costs are only this little triangle over here, which is obviously less, and it could be a lot less depending on how ambitious the standard is. The weird thing is when you move to two sectors. So here I have a second sector which is cleaner, that is the initial emissions are lower, and it has a tighter standard, and it also has steeper abatement costs. So when you imagine what happens here when there's trading, you're going to over-comply in the dirtier sector and run a surplus, and you're going to under-comply in the cleaner sector and run a deficit. But the sectors can trade. So assuming they're roughly the same size, this equilibrium could exist. But what happens to actual costs? Well, in the dirtier sector, you're getting all this additional revenue, and this is your increased abatement cost. This revenue more than compensates for your increase in abatement costs. So you actually have a net subsidy per unit of output. Meanwhile, the cost increase in the second sector is not as high as it would have been if you imposed the standard without trading, but it's still at least an increase. So in this sort of world, you would not only see a lower price increase, you would actually see a net subsidy to the sector number one, which if it was dirtier, presumably could lead to an increase in emissions. There are a variety of ways you could think about trying to avoid this. They basically fall into two categories. Either trying to harmonize the standards a bit more, so instead of having a very easy standard in the dirtier sector and a tough standard in the clean sector, move to something like the same standard in both sectors or subsectors. This is effectively what the Clean Power Plan did by creating what they call gas shift credits. They were like bonus credits that gas plants got that made their standard effectively closer to the coal standard. The other thing you could think about doing is trying to restrict trading between sectors or subcategories, or you could think about just trying to make adjustments over time to make them to avoid these sorts of things. But somehow you want to think about this and be aware of the risk. The other 2 points I just want to make briefly. Pretty obvious, if the price increase in the regulated sector like electricity is not as much as it should be, because of using a performance standard in that sector. If you go downstream and are regulating, say the steel sector that can substitute electricity for direct use of coal, you have to be really careful because the electricity price is not going to be high enough to come up with the same outcome as you would have if you directly taxed both, say, natural gas and electricity. And so you'll have too much electricity usage. So what that means in practice is you have to go, and when you regulate steel or whatever sector it is downstream of electricity, you have to set their benchmark to actually include their indirect emissions of electricity. And like I said, originally I thought this had to do with the fact that prices were regulated in China. It really has to do with the fact that you're using a tradable performance standard. My last point is just that in a lot of programs like California, as well as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, we've seen that price floors are very useful. A lot of times the standards get set very close to, or the cap gets set very close to not being binding at all. And there's a price that people have in mind as desirable based on maybe the social cost of carbon or incentives to innovate or something like that. And the price floors have frequently been binding. So this is just a graph of the allowances in California. Here's the reserve price. That's the way they set the price floor. And you can see they hit the reserve price in many of the auctions. So, my point is just that when you have an allocation mechanism that is based on output, and there's no auction, it's hard to think about how you would actually set a price floor. You could have the government buying allowances, but that creates a big fiscal problem. Or you could think about some other mechanism, and that's another line of research that we're thinking about. So this is just a list of documents that Xiliang put together that you can consult if you want to learn more about the design. But with that, I'm going to end my talk and turn it over to Valerie, who will continue the conversation. And again, if you have questions, don't forget them, just jot them down.